Hi, good afternoon. I'm Derek Gay. I'm class of 2016 and really thrilled for this session. Leadership and influence is something that I'm very passionate about throughout my career, is something that I've always gravitated to, learning more on the topic, and really excited for this session with Margaret Douglas. And the topic is on influence in today's uncertain times. And to tell you a little bit about Margaret, she's a certified coach and Kellogg School graduate who's fascinated with influence, both the science and practice of influence. Her experience includes influencing clients, teams, and consumers as a senior vice president at Digitas and Leo Burnett advertising agencies. Earlier in her career, she led Fortune 500 change management initiatives as a managing consultant for Capgemini. Through her current company, Douglas Leadership Coaching, she regularly coaches and advises clients to navigate disruption and maximize their impacts. So this session, it's designed as a workshop. We encourage you to really be involved in it and make sure to put your stuff in the chat. And if we were in person for this event, we would have breakout rooms, and we'd really dive deep into the topics. Amongst Is that being told no sound? Is anyone else able to hear me, or is this?
I can hear you, Derek. Now I'm curious. Can the audience hear me?
Okay, I guess it's okay now. So
great.
All right. So I was just saying that this is a workshop design. So really, the input that you guys can provide will be great for us. We'll have some leadership scenarios later as well that Margaret will lead, that we really want to hear from you. So anything in input you can provide will really, I think, strengthen the session. So I'm really excited, and I'll turn it over to Margaret.
Thank you so much, Derek. Well, let's jump right into our next slide. Derek and I are partnered up today. I'm a 95 grad. He's a 16 grad. I'm delighted to be working with the Dallas Alumni Club. I've known for many years this is one of the strongest clubs in the network, and I knew you guys did some amazing things. So it was an honor to be asked to join you today. We can keep going. Derek mentioned that my passion for influence, it's really a lifelong thing. I cut my teeth in the advertising industry and was always curious, why do people make the decisions that they make? So I want to open with sort of a classic quote from Ken Blanchard. The key to success in leadership today is influence and not authority. And I share this partly through my own personal experience. I've never been in a command and control style environment. I've often worked in team-based professional services environments. I've worked in higher ed with Kellogg. I work with, obviously, my clients as a coach. So influence is really near and dear to me, and it's been sort of a lifelong study and a lifelong interest. Today, I'm going to share 3 of some of my very favorite insights. There's so much more, but we'll scratch the surface with a little bit of the science of influence. And then we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to share some scenarios, and we're going to think about, how do you apply that science? How do you make a difference in your own leadership? So let's keep going. Okay, so this goes way back to 1955, when a gentleman by the name of French and Raven studied the basis of power. I still think this is somewhat relevant today. They talked about power coming from legitimate power, reward power, coercion. Over time, informational power was added. I think they added that in 1965. Expert power and referential. But what I want you to think about in this research from some time ago now is, when is your power coming from your position and the organization that you're in? And when is your power truly your own individual influence? And so towards the bottom of this list, you get into things like the expert power that many of us have invested time in building. Many of my clients are engineers and strong technical individuals, where that's a big part of how they influence. And then referential power, which is the power of our relationships. That's something that's very near and dear to me. And I think it's a really important important transition that most leaders make as they move from being expert individual contributors to leading increasingly large teams. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask the audience if we can kind of get involved, jump in the chat. My next slide should be a question. So I want you to think about what makes you influential. And a good way to do this is to just reflect on a significant leadership accomplishment that you've made in your career. Could be last year, could be 2 years ago, could be a peak point in your career, but something where you knew you were really having the impact that you wanted to because you were influencing. So you might think about who followed your lead, and you might think about why. How were you able to influence their decision to follow your lead? So go ahead, put something in the chat about how are you influencing today? From what I can tell, we've got 187 people. It's going to take a minute to reflect. You need a moment, but I'm hoping to see a few things.
And I'll jump in while we're, oh, here we go. We got some stuff coming in now. We have passion and drive.
Nice.
Passion on the subject, another jumping in there.
And then passion on the subject is a form of expertise too. So that's great. That's the combination of your emotional energy and your expertise.
Building consensus.
Nice. Really important.
Then empathy and inclusiveness. A cross-functional team through inclusion. Using both passion and information and data to drive your decisions. And then BJ has what's in it for them.
Nice. These are great.
Truly believing in other potential and being a regular resources to leader with relevant info.
We've got a great group here. Great group here. I mean, one of the ones I just noticed is listening, like really realizing that when someone, needs to be heard, that your role may be to listen and to really understand. And that may be one of the most influential things you can do. Character, competence, confidence. Okay, I have found the right tab. This is great stuff. So thank you. And hold that thought because I'm going to throw in some of the science that I promised to share. And then we're going to come back to some scenarios where you're going to think about what's made you successfully influential in the past and where you might want to change some things up. Okay? All right, let's move forward. One really key fact that I want to share is that, and this actually came up in some of the comments about character and, just confidence and how people experience us as leaders. So Susan Fisk at Princeton, she did some wonderful research, and she ultimately came to the conclusion that there are 2 dimensions of how people experience us that account for 82% of the variance. Those 2 variables are we warm and are we competent? Now, obviously you want to be in the upper right-hand quadrant, right? I drew my graph the way you want the graph to be drawn, where admiration is the emotion people are most likely to feel when we're warm and confident. None of us want to be in that lower left. There was another study done by Jack Zenger and Joseph Folkman where if you are low warmth, so if you're competent perhaps, but low warmth, you only have a 1 in 2,000th chance of being in the top quartile for effectiveness. They analyze performance reviews, 360s, things like that. So being warm is really, really important. And as I work with leaders that have extraordinary technical competence, this is something sometimes they need to just step back and understand, how are people experiencing me? Because if you are high competence, but low warmth, people might envy your competence, but they won't necessarily follow you. You're starting off on the wrong foot. This is an initial social impression. So something important to really understand, I'm looking in the chat and I'm seeing, demonstrating trustworthiness. Warmth is a really important part of being trustworthy. So another quadrant you don't want to be in is low competence, high warmth. This tends to be where, my Aunt Gertrude would say, oh, pity this person. Not where we need to be as leaders. So a nice piece of psychological research to think about, especially when you are forming a first impression with a team, with a partner. I was listening to Harry Kramer talk about boards. Wow, this is really important stuff. So let's move on to another little bit of science that might help us think about influence. Next up, reciprocity works. There's been a fair amount of research in this area, but I think Adam Grant, his book on givers and takers, and the Harvard Business Review article he wrote on the subject, really interesting stuff. So he talks about 3 different categories of people: givers, takers, and matchers. And it's interesting because giving takes time, right? So when I look at the really generous people on my own team, I'm like, hey, that's a nice stance, but we got a lot to accomplish right here. Like I'm a little selfish about what my resources are doing. And so what Professor Grant's done is he's really kind of looked at how do you get this balance right? And he's also said that first and foremost, you actually want to be in the giver bucket. His research was with sales associates. He's also partnered with other researchers that looked at different, one of them was in a telecom environment. So he's looked at this across a number of different environments. But by and large, being perceived as a giver and then gaining the skills that you will need to balance your giving, because there are a number of them. There's a good reason he wrote a whole book on this. That's really important. I'm just noticing a couple of really good questions. So maybe we touch on Sona and Vijay's questions about, is warmth empathy? And I would say yes, simply put. In the research that Susan Fisk did, she's got a lot of different descriptors under that category of warmth. Empathy and trustworthiness are one of them. And that may help us answer Sona. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So give me some grace because I can only see it typed. I can't hear you. But how do you demonstrate warmth? And that could in itself probably be an entire session. But I think some of the things that came up when I asked what made you influential, where some of you talked about listening, you talked about empathy and understanding another person's perspective. Those are all categories in the warmth bucket. So thank you for asking those great questions, and do keep them coming. I can't see your faces in this platform, so the chat box is a great way for me to know that you're with me, and that if you're stuck, if you're not capturing what I'm sharing, if it's not making sense to you, just go ahead and ask a question. Derek's kindly volunteered to keep an eye on the chat box for me as well. Oh, and Joy's adding in interest in the other person. That's another really great piece of warmth. I'm a fan, it's less research-based, but I'm also a fan of the book called The Trust Equation, where those authors, they also worked in professional services like myself, and they kind of break down trust to its many components. And one of the most important parts of the equation is showing your interest in someone else. Ooh, another nice suggestion from Mariano, check out The Path to Power from Jeffrey Pfeffer. You noticed I started with a little bit about power, and Jeffrey Pfeffer more recently has done a lot of research in that area. So Mariano, thank you for adding that in. All right, one third piece of science. I can talk about science all day, so I want to make sure that we balance our time. I want you to think about how you frame a discussion, a conversation, a point of view. This is really, really important. I think a lot of times when we're planning to be influential, and many of us do plan our approach, I know I certainly do, we realize that, first we start out with why I think this is important, but really, if I'm trying to convince a CFO, a head of sales, someone who's in a different role than I am, I really need to think about how they might be framing something. So, we've already seen some good things in the chat around taking another individual's stance. I think that's really important. So my first point here is that decisions can be swayed very much by how they are framed. Another piece of science that I wanted to share is This is what Daniel Kahneman, if you've read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he won the Nobel for some of his thinking on this. But essentially, loss avoidance can be more powerful than the benefits to be gained. So when I set a team out with a vision, I'm strong on vision. I'm convicted in vision. Somebody else talked about, passion being part of your leadership. I'm also a passionate leader. But I think one of the asks when the team from Texas was planning this conference was, how are we behaving in uncertain times, and what's happening in uncertain times? So realizing this avoidance of loss can be even more important than benefits gained, especially under times of duress and uncertainty. I think that's a really powerful insight. Not a quick read, Thinking Fast and Slow, but there's some really good insights there. And another piece that there's a lot of research around is just considering points of comparison. So when you are sharing an idea or a point of view with someone coming from a different point of view, it can really matter how you frame an argument. This is where, as a consultant, I learned to be really thoughtful in considering alternatives that we're not recommending, considering alternatives to the path that even the board may have aligned on, why we didn't take another path. That can be really important. So any questions on why framing matters? This group has also been great about adding insights, which I encourage. I do not have all the answers. I want to provoke some thought so that we can get into some scenarios. But questions or thoughts on how we frame some of the arguments when we want to be influential.
Ruben put a comment in there that the loss touches on what I have and feel, versus gain is more hypothetical many times.
So powerful, right? We're feeling the loss, and in uncertain times, we may be doing okay, but working with people that aren't doing okay. And I think we have to be really sensitive to how our teams are feeling, how our partners are feeling, because we don't know their lived experience right now in this pandemic. A lot of loss going on right now. So thank you, Ruben. Any other thoughts? All right, another bit of perspective that I thought would be really helpful, and you can advance the slide, Derek. Thank you so much for doing that. Oh, Mariano just threw another comment in the slide. Before we move on, sorry. Derek, you're being a good sport. I appreciate it. We've got some good questions. How do you pull people from frames and biases like the sunk cost fallacy? That's a great one. And the sunk cost one is a hard one because you've obviously done the reading, Mariano. You know that when someone else has made an investment and they've got something sunk essentially into one path of action, you may be able to get to that point where you're saying, I'm past that. That money's already gone. Much quicker than other people in the room. They may feel like you are unnecessarily changing course. So some simple things that you may need to do are to just stop and play out the scenario of continuing the path that you're on and why you don't think that that's going to lead to the results that will ultimately be best for either the team or the organization. But I think you may need to ground yourself in the constraints that the other individual is feeling and sensing before you can help them turn to the way you're seeing the problem. And I think this gets into some of the listening and the empathy that came up earlier in our conversation. So Carla asks, can I give an example of framing in a scenario? And one of the ones that I remember from when I was in my Moore's class at Kellogg that stuck with me, I love a good glass of wine, is how most restaurants put their wine lists together. And when you see a wine list that has a couple $100 options, maybe a $40 option, a $20, and, something that nobody's going to order that $15 bottle. Oftentimes when you see a range of things, maybe I wouldn't normally spend $50 on a bottle of wine, but when I see it relative to what this restaurant is setting forward as a norm, I might look at that price point a little bit differently. Right now, while we're ordering takeout, it's a whole different frame, but I appreciate the question, and that's sort of an easy way to think about it. Many of us that have worked in consulting, we're accustomed to, if we're recommending one option, we're going to need to investigate at least 2 or 3 to help everyone get comfortable. Ooh, Narasima, nice comment here. One way I talk myself out of sunk cost fallacy is by playing it out as if it happened to someone else and what I would tell them to do. So just that distance, disassociating this way, has helped me. Really nice. Nice. Another comment from Narasima, in general, framing related ones, I use this other in this situation. Really nice. Okay. So let's talk about the world that we're operating in today, the theme for this fantastic conference. I want you to reflect on your workplace. I want you to acknowledge that most of our businesses have been disrupted by the pandemic and other factors in 2020. And I want you to think about the challenges that concern you moving forward. Because as we jump into what I think are going to be some sort of classic generic scenarios, I want us all to have this lens of what is making 2021 uncertain for you. There's no right answer, and all are welcome.
And I think while we're waiting for comments to come in here, one of the things that I know we talked about before is just the challenge of influencing people in this current virtual environment, and going forward as we shift to more remote work, even long term, how that will change that dynamic. I know Professor Kramer touched on a bit where he's able to engage a lot still, and technology's come a long way. So just curious on your thoughts on that.
Nice, nice. So I'm a big Harry Kramer fan, no doubt. I think the empathy that he shows for leaders, for those of us that are, in that stretch point of the career, and the empathy that he shows for people in his organization, interactions with the board, just really, really helpful stuff. I'm going to confess that I was seeing things come up in the chat, so I'm not sure I answered your question, Derek. It's like social media. I can't look away.
Yeah, it's just around how you're able to influence your teams in this remote environment where there's a comment in there, waking up at 2 a.m. to work with my team in UK instead of being with them. So how can you use techniques to have that same level of influence when you won't have those interactions in person, and you may not be able to have those one-on-ones as frequently and get to really know a person outside of, hey, we're on this project, this task?
I have some ideas coming from my client interactions as well. I think, we're all trying to figure out different things that work. And if you have, 400 people at 2 a.m. in the UK, some of these scenarios are rough ones. This is a time where people really need to be heard. And I'm finding that they may or may not be comfortable letting you know what's really happening right now, how hard it might be for them to manage, remote learning, family members that are ill, colleagues that are ill. There's a lot of things that can be going on right now. And we have the added complexity of we're not meeting in person. And Harry talked about this. We're not getting a drink together. So individuals that are struggling are even less likely to share with us how they're struggling. One of my clients, I thought, did a really great job in thinking about, she couldn't touch everyone in her organization, but she wanted to know who is touching everyone in her organization. And she redoubled her effort to make sure that one-on-one meetings are happening. She felt that in some cases people were more comfortable with a phone conversation than being on video all the time, which is sensitive to people getting zoomed out. And I thought it was a really great idea. So she's been getting some results with that plan of attack. I think there's probably many others, but I think understanding that you may not know all of the struggles that your workforce is facing right now is super important. The difficulties that we all went through last summer, seeing, the murder of George Floyd and understanding, systemic injustices happening in our country, that's very, very difficult for many people on many teams to work through. And it's not an easy thing for people to talk about. So I think that, having a listening plan in your organization is kind of a good way to go. And now I'm seeing lots of things coming up in the chat. So we probably should go back
to the chat. Melissa
made
a comment about being a planner during these times. The planning still needs to happen, but you must have multiple options due to the uncertainty of how customers will engage back into the business.
I appreciate that. Melissa sounds like, an agile leader that realizes that the first plan may not be the plan that we can stick to. And I'm hearing that from a lot of clients.
And Carla's sharing what I think we're all feeling right now, that the uncertainty around the vaccine with regard to variants and how soon we'll be able to have in-person interactions.
That's a big one. That is a big one. And I've seen companies kind of plan multiple timelines, multiple scenarios. We're kind of going into scenario overdrive because we just don't know what that time frame is really going to be. So thank you for that, Carla.
And Janie talks about connectedness while also not letting technology distract and interfere with relationship building. I know that's something I've felt as well, where it seems that the work week has just become a perpetual the hours sort of never stop because you're always connected. I have all the resources at home now to respond to that email.
Yeah, and I like that word. Like, whether you like some of the ideas we've shared in this conversation or you have your own ideas for connectedness, I just think that's a great word to think about. How are you connecting with people in difficult and uncertain times? All right. Thank you, Derek.
The last one in there that Drew puts is that many businesses in 2020 were under the impression they had a few years to make changes, and the pandemic illustrated they had only a few months. So just the challenges of moving forward, balancing safety, digital experience, and mental health for all stakeholders.
Great. And I see Melissa giving some props to Janie. That's great. You guys can interact with each other too. Awesome. Okay, so with that as our backdrop, I've prepared some scenarios that I thought would be kind of fun to think about as a group. I have an answer to each of these, but I want to just be clear that these leadership challenges, there's no single answer. And when I work with clients one-on-one, we're trying to find the right answer for the organization that they're working with, for the individual that's working on their leadership. So there's a lot of variables. But with that said, I was pretty confident that you didn't want to hear me talk about my favorite nerdy science for this entire hour. So let's try to apply some of these concepts. My first scenario is one of future resource needs. I'm hearing from a lot of leaders that are seeing significant post-pandemic growth opportunities. So they know that when business reopens, boom, maybe travel is going to jumpstart or events are going to jumpstart. So you know that you're going to need resources down the road. How do you think that you might get people to help you so that when that time comes, this future time that someone brought up the point that we can't nail the time? I think it was Carla. We have uncertainty around when these things are going to happen. What would you do to influence this situation? Go ahead and put something in chat. I'm waiting. The group got quiet. Although I'm catching Chicago Gupta's comment about the pandemic has got you thinking about the concept of interdependence. And that's how I'm viewing this scenario, is that if you really want something big to happen post-pandemic and you need other resources, you are going to be dependent probably on other leaders in your organization.
So we have from Shelley, start building your pitch now and get feedback from your network.
Nice, nice. Yeah, plan ahead, think ahead. Everyone's really scratching their heads. All right, so I'll jump to some of the ways that I would think about this one. And Derek, you can go ahead and advance. I've got some thoughts. I think this is an opportunity for reciprocity. And I think that because the whole give and take model that I shared with you earlier, it really takes time to play out. And now I'm seeing great ideas jumping into the chat. Derek, should we go there for a minute?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think we might have a little bit of a lag.
That's okay.
But Mariano says, a fan of laying out the vision and including the team and how they can help. Keep a close touch with and identify key positions and people. Teresa said, leverage your network to see where people are, both internal and external. So you have a team of people to reach out to when the time comes. And then a couple more. I'm a firm believer of helping in all weather scenarios, so I'll be helping in all the times. Pitch the idea to trusted network and get advice for how to refine. And ask people how your idea will help them solve their business challenges.
These are great. Yep, these are great. It's already scrolled by, but one of the comments about looking at other people's pain points. Maybe this solves somebody else's pain point, which could be part of building an alliance. So reciprocity is a simple concept that, as you know, as leaders, plays out in a lot of different ways. But I think positioning yourself as a giver early is part of the way to, hopefully people will return the favor down the road. Another tip that I've found really helpful is I was always taught to just say thank you when someone gives me something. And as a leader, that's not always the right answer. You might actually want to not only say thank you, but share your philosophy. Thank you. I'm happy to help you. And that's just what partners do for each other, right? Just let people know that you're a giver, but you also appreciate that reciprocity. Another tip from Adam Grant's book is, sometimes being a giver means you have to manage your boundaries. So you do want to be protective of your productivity. There's some really interesting studies that suggest that you can be more successful in the long run, even if you give up some productivity in the short run. So when Harry Kramer talks about the long run, the short run game, that really resonates with me, because I think if you're thinking about giving and taking and reciprocity as part of your influence strategy, this is a place where there's a long game and there's a short game. And I sort of set up this scenario so that you've been thinking about your long game in your organization, because things are going to keep changing for all of us.
And I think going back to your comments on warmth and in that box there, warmth plus competence, just really being that genuine and authentic leader that, when you come out reaching for help and, you've been a giver, you've been involved and people want to go out of their way to help you.
Yeah, that's great, Derek. Thank you. Oh, I can tell that Jack likes Karen's idea. You want to read this one?
Sure. So Karen's saying, I am in supply chain, and before many were moving towards more globalized firms, I'm looking at shrinking my vendor base to a more national basis to support the rebuilding of our economy, especially with diverse and smaller vendors where feasible.
Nice, nice. So really thinking ahead to what this is going to look like. And maybe that's where part of your warmth and your reciprocity is knowing who you need to be in a relationship with and what you want that relationship to be. All right. Let's go ahead and introduce another scenario. It might trigger more thoughts. Okay. This one isn't quite as positive, but let's say that your customer base has changed significantly during the pandemic, which I think is a common scenario. To remain sustainable in 2021, you're clear that a change in direction is going to be needed. How are you going to convince your sizable staff? So I feel like this one, someone was talking about, maybe a staff far away in the UK. Somebody was talking about, what if you're going to have to lay off 300 people to save 100 people? So there's some tough stuff that's already come up in our conversation. But let's give this one a minute. I think one thing we've learned, Derek, is this is a bright group. They just need a minute to think. So we're going to give you that minute to just think about how are you gonna set the stage for this change of direction. Let's assume that your staff is a little uncomfortable. Your staff is scared.
And I think a lot about what you were talking about too, Margaret, with the sunk cost fallacy and the questions that we got from the group as well around that they're so invested in a way of doing things. So how would you, drive that vision and strategy to pivot in a new direction?
Thanks, Derek. That's really, I think that's relevant.
Okay, so Amy is the first to chime in here. Share the information with your known leaders and influencers first, and get their advice for how to best communicate and also get ideas you may not have thought of.
Nice. So what I hear there is a really thoughtful approach to fanning out in the organization. The word trust has come up earlier in our dialogue, and you might want to start with those trusted confidence. Great. Let's keep going.
And just a couple of them that sort of tie together: genuine, honest communication and transparency.
Nice.
Jack is talking about burning a platform you can convince by telling what will happen if you do not make the change.
Ooh, Jack caught on my loss avoidance, right? So part of convincing individuals to move can be around, hey, here's what happens if we don't move. Thanks.
And then back to your topic on framing, Mariana was chiming in there with frame the plan as positive, reinvention, resilience, and renewal. And Raj echoes that with a great opportunity for framing, best for all, whether leaving or staying. And Tara talks about building the case, lay out the facts, and changes in customer behavior and the estimated impact so that they will understand the need for change.
Nice. This is great. Derek, you can go ahead. I feel like the group is already beyond some of the things that I shared because they're applying a lot of different psychology to this, which is great. You are all officially scientists now. I did think that framing was really important here. You hear me talking about empathy, tell the team what they stand to lose if they fail to change. I would do this gently. I think this is sensitive. It may take place over several conversations. The one other thing that hasn't come up, but I will mention it because there is some great psychology behind it. In uncertain times, we turn to our experts. And I think about Fauci, of all the people, through this pandemic, we've all been like, what does Fauci say? But in your business, there are experts. They may not be the most senior people. They may just be the people that everybody respects. So I work in a lot of teams that are pretty flat, where just knowing somebody has a reputation for being really reliable and on the money, bring those people. Somebody talked about really a nice approach of just, fanning out gradually. Bring those people on board because their expertise can help you. Great. All right. So I'm looking at the time. It's not quite 3:40 yet. I think we have time for another scenario.
Sure.
Okay. A little bit of a sensitive topic, but I think it's something that's certainly been on our minds in 2020. Let's say that you know that women and minorities, they're just not getting a fair shake in your organization. If you want to use your influence to support them, what comes to mind here? And I know we're going to need a minute on this one. So let's give folks a chance to think about it.
So we have our first one here to sign up to volunteer for mentorship to help them feel empowered.
It's great.
And Shelley echoes that with mentor with folks who you feel have potential, and also support them.
Period. I see it.
So highlight successes where you have seen diversity succeed in your organization. Amy also talks about pair up with influential mentors that can make a real difference in their career path.
These are great. These are really great. Sponsorship. And Derek, why don't you go ahead and share my notes? There's a ton of great ideas in the chat. The one that I wanted to highlight, it comes out of some of the McKinsey research in this area, is around advocacy. And there's a couple different elements at work when we look at advocacy. Championship, having champions is really, really important. But the reason that championing someone else who, might be of a different race or, a woman in an environment that's very male is you are lending your authority to ensure that their accomplishments are noticed. So some of the biases that we're all aware of are, kind of the prove it again bias, where a majority their performance might be judged based on their potential and things that we think that they can do. And yet someone else in a minority might not benefit from that benefit of the doubt. They may be judged on, oh, well, have they done that before? So be on the lookout for that and lend your authority to ensure that when their accomplishments are very clear, they are well known within the organization. The other thing that I think is important in terms of influence in this scenario is that, as we go back to the warmth and competence matrix that I shared earlier, sadly, women and minorities can face backlash. They can be considered less warm when they are boastful and aggressive in ways that might be considered absolutely appropriate for a white male. So this is tough stuff. I threw this one in knowing that it would be a difficult one, and I'm really appreciative that clearly the audience was willing to engage. And I'm continuing to see the chat move. Lots of really great things coming up. I'm also going to do a quick little plug. We have some other speakers that are going to get into this topic in greater detail. So I believe Ellen Tafey is speaking tomorrow, and I think Tracy Carmen Jones is speaking on Friday. So I'll be trying to tune into some of those sessions as well, because I think there's going to be some good conversation. So do we have a hard stop at 3:45, or I wonder if our organizers...
Yeah, I think we could open up for some questions that the audience may have, get a couple questions, and then we can transition into the next topic.
Okay. All right. Any questions? We are nearing that time, so I want you to get the most value out of the session possible. I really love that last conversation. So if everybody else is looking at the chat like I am, we're all guilty of the same. All right. Well, I'm assuming that we should not introduce a new scenario, that we should probably wrap up at this point, Derek. Is that fair with what you're on the board?
Yes, I think we I'll see if some questions come in. We have some more comments on diversity while we're waiting. Just that allies need to step up to use their platforms and positions, but then bring the unrepresented voices into the room when you're talking about change initiatives. And I think that's just really key there to have that voice there.
This is nice.
All right, our first question. Any thoughts on networking to achieve leadership? And I think again with our uncertain times that we live in now, especially a pointed question.
That's a great question. So networking is a variety of concepts at work. Obviously, networking is a way to warm up a relationship even when you don't need that relationship. It is also a way to, have more people know about what you're good at and exchange information about what they're good at. So I am a big fan. I think what's important is how people go into networking, kind of balancing that give and take relationship, right? A lot of people only go into networking when they're looking for a job. I think that's a real miss. It's hard to find time for networking when we're in roles and we're busy and we're in a pandemic right now, right? But nonetheless, if you can be helpful and a meaningful resource to somebody now, even if it's just little things like comment on their post on LinkedIn, something to just say, I know you're out there, find those little touches. I do a lot of 10-minute coffee conversations just to keep in touch with people, keep my network fresh, know that I care about them. And I do recommend that to everyone. So great question. There's a lot of psychology at work, and I hope you don't mind me just sharing some practices that have worked for me and client conversations that I've been part of.
I guess the final question, then we'll wrap this up. How do you feel about hiring diversity leaders?
I think it's a terrific idea. I'm going to confess that the class of 95 has had an excellent conversation going on in this area. We've been sharing the many things that have happened since we graduated from Kellogg and had a really diverse, great group in our class. A lot of my classmates they've had success in recruiting. They've realized that maybe they need to go to, different talent pools to hire diverse. And one of the things that they're turning their attention to is inclusivity. Things that they thought were great about their culture, everybody gets along great, it feels great. Well, wait a minute. If we're all golfing or we're all beer drinkers or we're all, maybe we're not as welcoming to our diverse talent as we want to be. So the question that I'm hearing more and more about is really, how do I create a more genuinely inclusive environment where all voices are heard? And there were a ton of great ideas in the chat where, people talked about allyship tactics. They talked about how they can use their privilege to bring other people into the conversation. I'm a big fan of Amy Edmondson's research about safe spaces. I think Google brought this to the forefront when they found it was one of the most strong predictors of successful teams at Google was psychological safety. So if you've Googled, you can Google that, psychological safety in Google. They've published a lot of what they learned in that study. But I think that psychological safety is essential to bring diversity into leadership roles and to really create an environment where diversity can thrive. So thanks for hearing me on that. And again, we have other speakers that are going to address this topic head on. So I encourage those sessions as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Margaret. I know I really enjoyed your session, and judging from the chat, it seems like everyone else did as well. So thank you again.
You are welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.